ask you as well, the idea that an agency that is independent when it practices monetary policy, independent ideally from politics, means that the central bank can't be used to, for example, fund budget deficits year after year that are created by the politicians with a deliberate eye to that.
Well, that's exactly what they've been doing. That's what I'd like to stop. But as long as you have fiat money, they will tend to do that. They will tend to finance wars. The military-industrial complex loves the Fed because they can continue this process. But when they talk about independence, they're talking about secrecy. That's what they're talking about. They're not. They claim that we would politicize it. But today, I mean, do you think Goldman Sachs has politicized this? They politicize it. The chairman of the Federal Reserve Board was just reappointed, and over the years they have done studies to show that the Federal Reserve Board chairman always accommodates the president and tries to put the business cycle in the boom period so he can win re-elections and get reappointed. Mm-hmm. So it is very, very much politicized today. It's in secrecy, but I don't want the Congress to manage monetary policy day to day, so I don't want that type of management anyway. That's not what my argument's been.
Senator Sanders, I know we have to lose you in a couple of minutes. Congressman Paul mentioned a number of sponsors of this. How do you think this is going to fare in the Senate?
Well, I think we've got a lot in the Senate. We have 30 co-sponsors, which is a heck of a lot. And I would mention to you that in April, I introduced an amendment before the budget resolution on the floor of the Senate calling for transparency and demanding that the Fed tell us who received this $2 trillion plus dollars. And that won in a strong bipartisan vote, 59 to 39. So I think Congressman Paul is right in saying that all over this country, people are outraged by the chicanery that's taken place on Wall Street with the collusion of the Fed. People are demanding transparency. People do not want to go where apparently we're going right now, back to where we were before this crisis, so that we'll have a bigger one in 5 or 6 years. I think we need a serious discussion about the role of the Fed, and certainly I think transparency is an integral part of that discussion.
And Senator Sanders, before I let you go, what do you think the status of health care reform is in Congress, especially the public option?
Fight as hard as I can for a public option. I think it's absolutely imperative that the American people have a choice about whether they want a Medicare-type option as opposed to private insurance. And second of all, if you're talking about cost containment and the rapidly rising cost of health care in America, I think the private insurance companies need some competition in order to keep them honest. So we're going to fight very hard for that, and we will see what happens.
Senator Sanders, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
We'll be back with Congressman Paul in a moment. I'm Pat Morrison. We are talking about a measure on Capitol Hill that would require more accountability, more auditing, and more oversight for the Federal Reserve, about the billions of dollars that have gone out the front door of the Federal Reserve. And as you heard, Senator Bernie Sanders, the Vermont Independent, is concerned about the lack of accountability in that. So is Congressman Ron Paul, who is a Texas Republican, who will be taking your calls here as well at 866-893-5722, 866-893-5722, if you have questions for Congressman Paul. Congressman Paul, we left off with Senator Sanders on a question about health care reform. You're also an MD. What are your thoughts about health care reform and how it should look in this country?
I probably don't have any more confidence in the government managing health care than I have in the Federal Reserve managing the monetary system and the business cycle. So I'm not much into this more government. I see it that the government's been involved since the 60s, and they have served the corporation. They serve the drug companies and the insurance companies and the health maintenance companies, and they get in the way, and they push. When government gets these programs in, they tend to push costs up, but they never give better services. And even now, even with Obama's program, he's really pushing a lot more customers into the insurance industry. The insurance industry is actually going to benefit by this because everybody who's uninsured will be forced to have insurance, and this will be a great into the billions of dollars of more cash flow to the insurance companies. So I don't think we're on the verge of any improvement in the medical care system in this country.
So you don't think that expanding a program like Medicare to extend to, say, the grandchildren of people who are on Medicare is a good idea?
Not unless we paid for it and it was temporary. My program over the last years has been that even though I advocate, a strict constitutional libertarian viewpoint, I'm not closed-minded to taking care of people who become dependent on government. But you can't just, pay for it out of thin air. You do need the Fed then. If you pay for it out of thin air, then you don't have the money, you can't tax, you can't borrow. So you have to get the Fed to print the money, and then you're back into the problem again. So I would say the only way I would support a program like that is if people would be willing to cut spending, and my argument is you should cut money from all the militarism, the overseas spending, the kind of wars that continue. We could cut enough there. We could tide people who absolutely have no medical care, but I would still argue for the market place to deliver medical care because we haven't had that in more than 50 years.
Congressman, your book is called End the Fed. You and Senator Sanders may agree on more scrutiny and oversight, but I think you may disagree on what to do with the Fed in the end. You write in the book, the Federal Reserve should be abolished because it is immoral, unconstitutional, impractical, promotes bad economics, and undermines liberty. Its destructive nature makes it a tool of tyrannical government. What should replace it, if anything?
You don't really need to. We haven't had a central bank most of our history. We've only had it since 1913. The mandate was to give us a sound dollar and steady interest rates and full employment. Interest rates are anywhere from 1% to 21%. The dollar is not sound. We've lost 96% of its value since 1913. And unemployment is continued to rise. So I would say they have totally failed in giving us, fulfilling their mandate. But before 1913, we didn't have it. It was less than perfect because they didn't follow the rules steadily. But if anybody looks at charts starting in 1971, when the last link of our dollar to gold was severed, you would see that all the debt has skyrocketed. All the price inflation has skyrocketed, and actually the standard of living for the average person, especially in the last 15 years, has gone down. So, in spite of all the fanfare, the standard of living for average working people is going down, and it's because of the devaluation of the money.
So, Congressman, should we go back to the gold standard, or should we back it with salt or copper, or how should that work?
Well, we should go back to the Constitution, and which says that don't print money. You're not allowed to print money under the Constitution. Only gold and silver is legal tender. But there were some shortcomings in the 19th century because they mandated gold and silver and they fixed the rate together, and they should have varied. So we can go forward with a more modern gold standard. The main purpose of a gold standard is to restrain the growth of government. When government grows, individual liberty is threatened, and governments tend to pursue militarism. So if anybody wants to curtail this wild spending, supporting either the banking system or the industrialists or the military establishment, they have to look at the Reserve and find out that is the way they get financed, because they steal value from the middle class. Middle class always gets wiped out. Just think of how the middle class has been wiped out in Mexico. Every time they have a peso crisis, the middle class savings are destroyed. Mm-hmm. Right now, Mexico now has introduced a silver standard. You can actually save in silver because the middle class has been wiped out so many times in Mexico. So you have to protect the middle class. The characteristic of inflation is the destruction of the middle class.
Congressman, we have a question in Culver City from Charles. Charles, thanks for your call.
Hello, Dr. Paul. My question is, could you elaborate a little bit on how the Federal Reserve is used to finance unnecessary wars, and kind of break down for those of us who don't really understand money and monetization very well, how the taxpayer, the average citizen, winds up suffering.
All right, let's. We don't have too awfully much time with the congressman, so let's get to his answer.
Well, very briefly, governments never have enough money to fight wars. If the people had to pay for them, they wouldn't fight the wars. But because they can hide the spending, what they do is they run up debt, and that's a treasury bill. And the market, if you had this, borrow the money in the market, interest rates would be maybe 15 or 20%, and that would be unhealthy. So what they do is the Federal Reserve buys these treasury bills, but they have a computer. They have no money. They just create money out of thin air. Some weeks, I look at these reports every week, some weeks they create $50 billion in 1 week. Now, how that hurts the middle class is it dilutes the value of money. The middle class inflation rate is always much higher than anybody